Welcome to the show. So picture this. A train smashes into a road train at a level crossing. And the easy headline is, "Driver ran the lights." Nice, tidy, blamey. Absolute rubbish if you stop and actually look at it. Most serious incidents do not begin with one clown doing one silly thing. They usually start earlier, quieter, and higher up the food chain, with a leadership decision that changes the system. A layout gets tweaked, a workload gets cranked up, an operating model changes. Somebody says, "Yeah, that'll do." And from that moment on, the risk is already on the move. Take that level crossing example from the SafetyWise material. On paper, the police reckon the road train driver ran flashing lights and bells. Real simple. Except the crossing setup had history. The induction loop couldn't go at 300 meters, where it should have delivered about 35 seconds of warning for a triple road train. So the company made a choice years earlier, 260 meters instead. At 25 kilometers an hour, that gave about 22 seconds. Fine for a double road train, apparently. Then later, the operating model changed again. Two-person train crews became driver-only operation, using remote controls that were really intended for walking beside the train through spurs and points. Guess what workers started doing? Driving from the front footwell. Now, add one more little gem. On the morning of the crash, the train hit the induction loop at 42 km, not 25. That dropped the warning time to about 11 seconds. Police later estimated the road train needed about 14 seconds reaction and braking time. 14! The bloke never had the physics available to save himself. But sure, let's call it driver error and knock off for smoko. Same story with the helicopter maintenance incident. On the day, a Bell 412 had a nitrogen cylinder in the nose section that had to come out to access the work. That removal had not been previously identified or planned. The chief engineer gave minimal instructions. No OEM manual or specific discharge method was available, and the maintenance crew were already under heavy workload, with multiple helicopters and labour hire support in the hangar. Then, AME number 2 manually discharged the cylinder and copped an uncontrolled release of about 3,500 psi of nitrogen. Serious injuries, aircraft damage. So what caused it? The bloke at the cylinder? Or the decision to let unplanned work proceed without proper documentation, risk assessment, or competent guidance? That's the question investigators keep missing. Frontline action matters, of course it does. ICAM never says humans don't matter. What it says, and thank God it says it, is where there's a sharp-end error, go find out who moved the cheese upstream, who changed the layout, who accepted the workaround, who let the job start without the barrier, the procedure, the training, the warning time, the supervision. Because by the time the worker makes the mistake, the game may already be rigged. When you work through the SafetyWise workbooks, the same ugly little family keeps turning up at the barbecue. No risk assessment before a change, poor supervision, unclear scope of work, weak contractor management, no formal procedure. Different shirt logos, same mess. Look at the greater near-miss case from the governance workbook. Two labourers were 1 to 2 metres from a reversing grader. No positive communication, no radio, no agreed hand signals, no clear line of sight with a designated spotter. No JSEA or Take 5, even though it was mandatory. The scope of work between the grader operator and labourers was unclear. The leading hand and area supervisor weren't aware the grader was operating without a spotter, and safe working practices around mobile plant were ignored and went unchecked. But if it had gone properly bad, I guarantee someone somewhere would have typed, "Workers failed to maintain separation." Cheers, detective. Same pattern in the cable misidentification case. Cables terminated without testing. No labels. Scope of work advised verbally. Contract timings too tight. Drawings not shared. No dedicated electrical QA on site. Client accepted inspection and test records without proper verification. That is not one worker having a rough Tuesday. That is contractor management, communication, procedures, and organisation having a coordinated collapse. And then there's the LV rollover. Heavy rain for 7 days, pooled water, mud and slurry. Driver inexperienced on gravel roads and had never driven that road before. Informal journey management plan. No task risk assessment for a lone driver in a remote area. No formalised training in place for JMP. Road condition alert timing inconsistent. Previous rollover actions not followed up. No rollover protection installed as required. The driver exceeded the posted 80 limit and didn't drive to conditions. Yes, but the system also tolerated speeding behaviour, failed to communicate road conditions, and left competence to chance. That's not leadership by design. That's leadership by hope. And hope is not a control. Good leadership looks very different. It monitors. It doesn't just issue instructions and vanish. It makes scope explicit. It checks whether the contractor actually meets the standard, not whether the paperwork looks pretty in a folder. It resources the work. It notices when formal work as imagined and actual work as done have drifted apart. It treats ICAM findings as a repair manual for the business, not a search warrant for the nearest operator.
And look, I get the temptation.
I really do. Jobs are busy. Engineering changes are expensive. Calling stop on a half-baked task is politically awkward. You tell yourself, we'll sort the proper paperwork later. Or, he's experienced, he'll be right. I've seen that movie too many times. It starts with convenience, comfort, time saved. Exactly the sort of rewards Scott Geller warned about. And it ends with a siren, a statement form, and leaders acting surprised. Don't be surprised by the risk you quietly accepted last week. So what should leaders actually do before the next incident lands on the desk like a dead fish? First, challenge change, properly. If the operating model changes, the layout changes, the workload changes, the contractor changes, the staffing changes, that is management of change, whether or not anyone had the decency to call it that. If the work is different, the risk is different. Treat it like grown-ups. Second, insist on planning before motion. SafetyWise bangs this drum for good reason. Goal: gather, organize, analyze, learn. Before that, immediate actions and investigation planning. Same logic applies operationally too. Define scope. Set terms of reference. Know what work is actually being done. Brainstorm the data sources: people, environment, equipment, procedures, organization. PIPO is not just an investigation tool, it's a cracking way to expose where the safe system is thin before it tears. Third, verify competence. Don't assume it because someone's got grey hair, a ticket, or a confident swagger. In the helicopter case, the engineer was competent in general maintenance, but unfamiliar with that specific aircraft and that specific discharge method. In the LV case, the driver was four-wheel drive trained, but inexperienced in gravel road driving on that road. Competence is task-specific. If you haven't checked it, you haven't got it. Fourth, when recommendations come out of an investigation, force them up the hierarchy of controls. Eliminate, substitute, isolate, engineer, and only then muck around with administrative controls and PPE. Administrative actions have their place, sure, but they are the Weet-Bix of corrective actions. Useful, not magic. Retrain the worker and remind everyone at pre-start are not a strategy if the design, contractor setup, supervision model, or barrier system is crook. Now, where do ICAM, 5 Whys, and fair and just culture fit? Pretty neatly, actually, if you don't turn it into a bureaucratic circus. Use a risk-based approach. Low-level events. 5 Whys can be useful if you've gathered decent facts and don't stop at symptoms. Higher consequence or high potential events. ICAM, because you need the full picture. Absent or failed defenses. Individual or team actions. Task and environmental conditions. Organizational factors. And fair and just culture? That comes after the systemic investigation, not instead of it. First, understand the system. Then, if there's uncertainty about accountability, use the fair and just process. Separate learning from discipline. Otherwise, you just get silence, fear, and worse reporting. Safety leadership in 2026 is not about arguing over titles or slapping "safety first" on the lunchroom wall. It's about whether your decisions reduce risk so far as reasonably practicable, whether you monitor, whether you resource, whether you listen when an ICAM chart tells you your own decisions are sitting there in the causal pathway. So here's the only question I'll leave you with. If your next incident report lands on your desk tomorrow, will it describe a worker mistake or a leadership decision that made the mistake inevitable? Catch you next time.